There's that peculiar silence right after you realize the pitch is going wrong, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every inhale in the room. I never noticed the bright, ugly neon glow from the exit sign until now, too flushed to look at the faces lining the darkness beyond the stage lights. My palms pressed into the splintered edge of the podium, my notes flickered tremulously in my shaking hand, useless, each line already rinsed clean by panic. I had spent months preparing a 3-minute investor pitch for my documentary project, a film that meant everything to me. The story of the Turkish guest workers in Berlin, their families, the way they stitched their dreams into the city's fabric but never quite blended in. All the late nights with my battered camera, all the stories I'd gathered in Turkish cafes and blocky playgrounds squeezed between tenements. Thank you, Lena, the moderator interrupted, voice clipped. You have 30 more seconds. A couple rows away, I spotted my Uncle Halil. His expression was more painful than the snickers from the two men in sharp blue suits to my left. I'd begged him to come for support, but he just sat bolt upright, not quite meeting my eyes. The waitresses at the back were already noisily setting out glasses for the next break. I believe this film will show another side of Berlin, I stammered. A side that's often overlooked. I know the community well, I grew up there. My voice faded. My pitch, the one I'd rehearsed hundreds of times, now lay in ruins, invisible confetti at my feet. I made the mistake of looking at Inez Schmidt, the festival organizer, who offered a smile so brittle it might have shattered if I'd touched it. Afterwards, as I packed my bag backstage, my uncle stood in the doorway, arms crossed. He didn't say anything right away. Then, you see, I told you, there's no future in this. Nobody wants to watch old home movies with subtitles. These people, he waved vaguely at the auditorium where the other pitchers were shaking hands. They don't care what we've lived. They want money, not memories. I nodded, staring at the frayed shoelace on my right boot. Come back to Kreuzberg, Lena, Halil said softer. Get a proper job, enough of these dreams. You're making yourself sick with it. It wasn't just him, there was also my mother who'd insisted I was wasting my education, Auntie Amel who smirked about my artsy nonsense whenever anyone asked, cousins who had quietly started to avoid me at family gatherings so they wouldn't have to answer awkward questions from their parents. Even at the local cafe, Layla, who'd once shared baklava with me, pulled a face when I mentioned I was still filming. It got so that I edited alone at my little desk into the small hours, a blanket wrapped over my shoulders, just to dull the shape of my own disappointment. That investor pitch was the last straw. For weeks I hardly left my apartment except to shoot isolated interviews, awkward, halting conversations with laborers at construction sites, older women clutching faded childhood photos, friends of friends who kept checking their watches. I thought about quitting completely, trading in my camera for a shift at a supermarket like my cousin Yasmin, maybe answering the phone at a travel agent, anything to stop feeling lost, but grief gives you a strange kind of clarity. After the humiliation wore off, I started to see things plain. Every person in my footage, Emma in her neat blue hijab, brushing breadcrumbs from her son's jacket. Hassan, arms thick with dust from work, pausing to describe the way his father sneaked out at night in the 60s to sing Turkish folk songs in the park. They weren't just stories, they were lifelines, theirs and mine. I kept filming, but I stopped waiting for approval. I sold my old Vespa, ate rice and yogurt for weeks, chipping away at my savings to rent sound gear. A friend from university, Teresa, lent me her editing suite in exchange for fixing coffee every afternoon. I crowdfunded energy bars and bus tickets, cold-pitched every minuscule festival I could find. My application emails became short and sharp, stripped of apology, my voiceovers on the rough cuts truer and stronger. Sometimes, late at night, I listened to the city's distant train whistles and forced myself to believe there was still a purpose in hearing these stories, even if nobody else wanted them. By degrees, small things shifted. A Turkish youth center asked if they could show some early scenes. An elderly woman pressed a €10 bill into my palm after an interview and told me not to give up. Once when I dropped a camera bag, a stranger helped me up and said in deliberate accented Turkish, "We need people like you." I clung to such moments. 2 years dragged by. The film became my only anchor, sharpening my grief into resolve. Sometimes the city stank of car exhaust and rain, sometimes the riverside gleamed silver in summer, sometimes I felt so acutely alone that I'd call my mother just to hear her say, "Why not become a teacher like your cousin?" But I kept moving frame by frame. Spring arrived sticky and uncertain. I stood in the cool hush of a cinema, pulse fluttering as my phone buzzed. Your submission has been selected, Berlinale Doc Panorama. It took me 3 days to call my mother, and when I did, all I could say was, guess what? Her voice was thick. Good Lena, maybe you can finally stop chasing shadows. I let her have that. She would have to see the film for herself. Berlinale weeks smelled of popcorn, aftershave, adrenaline, and rain. I wore my hair in its wildest curls, my grandmother's style, and a second-hand black coat I'd found at a street market. My film would premiere on Friday evening, slotted between an award-winning French documentary and a brawny American portrait of homelessness. My screening wasn't sold out, but I recognized the faces filtering in: students, graying Turkish grandfathers, a sprinkling of bespectacled critics, the Turkish consul, a couple from my old building in Kreuzberg, my high school German teacher Teresa, and reluctantly, my uncle Halil, flanked by 2 cousins. As we waited at the theater entrance, my mother shuffled her feet, clutching her big leather purse. Auntie Amel was here too, arms folded under her chest like armor. "I thought you'd wear something more official," she muttered. "She looks fine," my mother replied. I felt suspended between the two, their voices fading as the house lights dimmed. The audience stirred, expectant. I slid into the darkness, heart racing. The opening scenes, children chanting outside a migrant worker's home, the click of dominoes on uneven kitchen tables, drew an audible hush. I listened to every breath in the house, every awkward cough, heard people crying in the back rows. Felt this thing I'd made straining to meet the gravity of all those lives. My narration came softer than I'd remembered, but it held. About halfway through, I stole a quick glance at my family row. My mother had her fingers pressed to her lips, eyes glistening. Auntie Amel didn't shift at first, but she stopped fidgeting. Even my uncle sat rapt, hands flat on his knees, staring at the flickering screen as if daring it to falter. Then there was a scene with Halil himself, an old interview I'd tucked in at the last minute. The camera had caught him in the half-light of our favorite cafe, voice gruff, as he explained building houses in Berlin after the wall fell. "We wanted our kids to feel at home here, even if nobody else wanted us, but I always wondered if it would matter in the end." His words vibrated through the auditorium, sharp as glass. For a long stretch after the film, nobody moved. Then the applause, hesitant at first, swelled and kept going while I blinked against wet eyes. I stood by the stage as the credits scrolled. People shuffled toward me, pressing hands and questions, but I kept watching my family. My uncle Halil rose slowly. His jaw worked as if to speak, but nothing came out for a beat. Auntie Amel was dabbing her cheeks with the back of her hand, trying to look like she'd gotten something in her eye. My mother walked to me without a word and wrapped her arms around my shoulders. I felt myself trembling. The old humiliation from the pitch, the years wound tight like wire around my chest, began to loosen at last. Something happened in that theater, a subtle but seismic shift. The skeptics, the ones who'd never believed, who thought I was doomed to fail, now saw something real and heavy projected onto a 30-foot screen, proof that the artsy nonsense had grown teeth and consequence. There was no room for denial. The pain, beauty, and humor I'd gathered from our corners of Berlin mattered, and now strangers sat shoulder to shoulder soaking it up. That night on the U-Bahn home, my uncle tapped my arm. "Do you know, Lena," he said quietly, "I didn't realize all those stories, you made them alive. I'm proud, really." I glanced at him, unsure if I should laugh or cry. He looked away, cheeks flushed, but his hand lingered awkwardly on my shoulder for a moment, a language of its own. Success is not clean or triumphant. Fame in a community like ours seeps in strange ways. The months after Berlinale became a blur, press interviews, festival tour, lunch invites from the Turkish community center, small envelopes with polite honoraria. Old neighbors left gifts by my door, figs, spiced bread, handwritten congratulations. Even people who had once questioned my tenacity now debated film theory over key and sesame rolls. There was grief in it too. I felt the yawning space between who I'd been, awkward outsider, embarrassment, daydreamer, and who I'd become, suddenly a model for every cousin's stubborn child with a hidden sketchbook or guitar. My mother would take my hand across the breakfast table and say, "I can't believe you did it. Maybe you can teach a workshop now." Old habits die hard, but it went deeper. One day, Layla from the cafe called me over. Her voice was warm but nervous. "I watched your film, Lena. I told my daughter about you. I said you can be brave like Lena too." She grinned, a soft, knowing smile. In Kreuzberg, walking home from the elementary school where I'd agreed to give a short talk about documentaries, I saw a flyer with my name, spelled correctly, tacked to the bus shelter. For a second, the grey February afternoon glowed. I still pass by the auditorium where I flopped at the investor pitch. The neon exit sign is always there, blazing impassive above the doors, but now it reminds me not of failure, but of the place where humiliation turned into intuition. Grief taught me how to listen, clarity taught me how to persist, and each time I visit my mother for tea, she puts the big photo of my Berlinale night on the living room dresser, just beside the framed wedding pictures and the childhood snapshot of me balancing on a garden chair, holding a toy camera. It's not a happy ending, it's just the beginning of something truer, a kind of return both to my people and to myself. The old doubts still surface, sometimes when the city billows with spring rain, sometimes in the hush before a new screening. But now, when I look around the circle of friends, family, and strangers who claimed my story for their own, I see a tide that carried me back, not to perfection, but to a place where the dream, once ridiculous and despised, matters more than anyone could have guessed.